Hello, in this video we're going to be adding checkpoints to the game. So we're going to go over to the scene so we can see what's going on. So we're going to skip this, we're going to start from the beginning to make sure everything works right. Let's skip the intro here. And so what I've done is I've added two different checkpoints to the scene. So we're going to just run through this real quick. So we have passed one checkpoint. Basically, I have a zone here that's considered a checkpoint. If we expand this and look at our checkpoints here, you can see this blue rectangle here. This is considered a checkpoint. So this is a zone which basically checks to see if the player is within this box. So that's checkpoint 1. And then we're going to continue on, but before we do that, let's just die and see if we start from our checkpoint. We shouldn't be starting from the beginning, and we're actually just starting from a different position. So now we're going to continue on. We're going to go and trigger the second checkpoint, and it's actually past this point here. And what I've also done is I've made it so that you can skip this intro. So if you press any key during the intro, it'll skip. So now we're going to hit the second checkpoint. On the second checkpoint, we take a look here. I'm just going to expand this so we can see. Second checkpoint is actually like a literal, it's a trigger. So when you pass this, it's going to trigger that checkpoint. So we're going to come up here. Go past it, boom, checkpoint reached. So now we've hit the second checkpoint. So I'm just going to move ahead a little here. I'm just going to hit E to explode. And we should start from our second checkpoint, which we are. There's Mega Man, is going to come in. So that's our second checkpoint. And I'm just going to kill myself. I'm going to kill myself again. Yeah, ignore that. And now if we start to continue, we start from the beginning, so the checkpoint has been cleared. And so let us take a look at the Checkpoint Manager, which basically keeps an eye on all this. So right now, it has no data. It's starting fresh, so we're going to do this again. We're going to go through the first checkpoint. We're going to see what happens. Now you can see that it passed through a checkpoint named Checkpoint 1, and it's got all this data. So we have where the player positioned, so when the scene restarts, this is where the player is going to be at when the scene starts. This is where the camera is going to be at when the scene starts. And these are the bounding positions for the section of the world that we're currently in. And if this had an event to be called, it would be called. This one doesn't. The second one does, though. So we're just going to go ahead. Pass this. Skip this. Okay, so now we're going to pass through the second checkpoint. And there. So now you can see that we passed through the second checkpoint. And uses all the data for that. Here's the player position, camera position, etc., etc. So we're going to be doing these checkpoints for today. And let's get started. Okay, we're back. So we have the previous project open. This is number 33, Adhering Susie. If you haven't been following along, there's a link in the description to my GitHub that has all the source code for everything. But if you have, then open up your project. So these checkpoints are basically respawn points. So consider you have a large level, or even not that large of a level, and when you get to, say, towards the end and you die, and maybe you don't want to have to start all the way from the beginning. So you have these things called checkpoints, which are basically kind of like points where you will, when the scene restarts or whatever other event you want to happen, the player will start from that new point instead of from the very beginning. So there's some things to consider with this. Simple one would be just to respawn the player, move the camera, and be done, right? But in this case, we have some things that we have to consider when we're doing this, like we have camera transitions, right? So when you pass through a camera transition, it assumes that you are now on the other side of the transition. So if you go back the other way, it knows to pan the opposite direction. Well, when the scene reloads, all that information that the camera transitions had is now gone. It's basically starting over from its default state, per se. So if you have spawned beyond that point and you're starting with all the default state on the camera transition, well, it's not going to react the right way when you try to go back through it. Yes, there are other ways you can basically, keep them from going backwards, but, there's not always the case where you can do that. So we're going to have to build in a remembering system for when we pass these checkpoints for certain things. Like when we pass a certain point, when we go through these transitions, like also the camera follow, the boundaries for the world also change. So that's also something that we'd want to remember. So we're going to be taking a little bit step beyond just a basic checkpoint system. Now, this is a system I come up with, and it can be used in a general sense, but it's more geared in line for how we're working with our game here. So anyway, with that said, we're going to add in the changes. So first thing we're going to do is I have prefabs that I've created. Now, my checkpoint system, I have two different types of checkpoints. I have one that's based off of an actual game, like a trigger object, or I have one's the zone. Now, the zone is basically you define a rectangle, and if the player basically goes within that rectangle, that triggers that checkpoint. And then you have the other kind that's basically, just a general unity trigger, like box collider or whatever with the trigger check. So I have two different kinds, and you can use whichever one depending on how you want to use it in your game. So I offer both options. And then we have the actual checkpoint manager. So what happens is when you actually go through a checkpoint, the data that your checkpoint has gets relayed up to the manager. So when the scene restarts, it's the manager that says, okay, hey camera, you need to move here. Hey player, you need to go over there. And then if there are any events that need to be called, like passing through walls moving, cameras need to be removed, camera transition data needs to be set back so that, everything is in check, boom, then the checkpoint manager basically makes that happen. So we're going to bring in these prefabs. Just going to send that over, and then we're going to send over the manager prefab, and we're going to send over this meta file. Now down here, we're going to send in the changes for the scene, but not yet. And let me check out this main scene. Okay, so in this one, I should probably have brought this in sooner, and I'm just doing it in this video. I could have probably did another video or a side video. But we're going to have the option to be able to skip Dr. Light, that whole dialogue scene. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to have this bool here that says skip the dialogue. We're going to add that in there. And then down here we have this part in the hologram state. And so what we basically do is we're going to look for within the time of 5 to 24 seconds, basically 5 because I want him to still run in to where he stops. And so anywhere between 5 and 24 being that's where the dialogue window will disappear and then the whole flicker thing starts with the hologram flickering out. So within this time frame, we're going to be looking for any key being pressed, and if the dialogue has not been triggered, then we're going to trigger it, so we only do this once. And then what we're going to do is we're going to advance the runtime to 24 seconds, and then we're going to adjust the start time so that it doesn't try to start over. So we're going to basically jump ahead within that whole storyline so that we can skip it. So that's basically how we do that here. So we're going to send that over. Now down here, we're going to, that is just an extra line. I don't know how that got in there. And then we're going to basically keep ourselves within the same scene. So when the main scene ends, it's going to start the main scene again. So I said that in the thing of the last video, we're going to be bouncing between this back and forth between stage segments. Now we're just going to stay in the main scene. And then down here is to comment. And what we're going to do is this checkpoint reached gets called. and where it shows that message on screen that says checkpoint reached, and it changed the level state to the checkpoint, and it moves the left wall, so it blocks Mega Man in on that broken highway. And what it was doing, it was disabling the trigger. Well, we're going to comment out that disabling of the trigger because we need to be able to get that trigger's properties. So can't really get properties of game objects that are disabled. So we're going to send that over. We're going to save that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to send over our checkpoint actual script, which we will take a look at. And then we have these changes. So let's take a look at the camera transition. So what I had to do was the camera, all the objects I'm going to be tracking, like the checkpoints, you need to know if you pass through a checkpoint. So when the scene reloads, you lose that information. So we need to know that a checkpoint's been passed. So same thing with the camera transition. So the way I keep track of them is through lists, but the problem with the lists is it's a reference to the object. It's not a copy of the object. So to be able to retain the settings of this, I have to introduce a new class in here, which is basically just a generic class that's not under mono behavior, and that's going to retain all the properties. So this class is going to have all the settings that are inside of here copied into it, and this is going to be added to the list. And so when the scene reloads and the checkpoint manager has a copy of all this data, then we're going to put it back in. So this is basically kind of like one step in this direction of serialization, like saving game states, like loads and saves and things like that. So this is basically all the data that we want to save for this object, or this class. And so we're going to need this to be able to do that for our checkpoint system, because we need to retain the settings for our camera transitions. So when the scene reloads, we need to know what were they before, what were they at the end of the scene before it reloaded. So the next part is down here. We have these two functions, get settings and put settings. And so that camera transition settings class, we're going to pass that to the get, and then what it's going to do is all the settings that are in this class are going to be stored in this this object here, and it's going to be passed as reference. So it's going to be created outside and then put in here, and then when this is done, it's basically going to be saved over there. So you're going to save all this data, and then the put settings is basically the opposite. You're going to pass the object, and it's going to take all the settings that are inside that object and put them inside of this camera transition to restore its settings. So then we're going to send that over, settings. So we're going to save that. So that's the changes for the camera transition. And then we have some stuff for the game manager. So we're going to send over, so I'm going to basically get a handle to the camera follow, which is over on our main camera. So we're going to get that. And I don't know what happened with formatting, but this is just formatting stuff, so I don't worry too much about that. Now down here, so what we do is when the start next scene obviously gets called when scenes, next scene starts. So upon the next scene start, what we want to do is tell the checkpoint manager to reset itself so that it basically wipes out all the settings that we have. So it doesn't know about the last checkpoint that we passed through, so it can basically start fresh. So we need that here. So we're going to send that there and in the overloaded version of it. And then we're going to come down here and we're going to send over the comment change. And down here we have camera follow. So this is where we're going to, like we got the player object, we're going to get a handle to the camera follow script out of our main camera. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to check and see if our checkpoint instance is not null. We're going to get to the checkpoint class in a second. So checkpoint class instance is not null, then what we're going to do is we're going to tell the scene to update. And basically this function, update scene, is going to say, okay, hey player, move the player over to that position, move the camera over to that position, restore all the settings, call any events. So that's what that's about. So we're going to send that over there. Now we're going to skip this for now because I want to show you what happens when this isn't in play. So we're going to skip that for right now. And this is some more formatting what happened. And down here, then this is called teleport finished. So this is part of what's up there, but this can be added in right now. So we need to know when the teleport is finished, and the reason behind that is because we're going to detach the player from the camera follow script. So because you know that if the player is above the camera is going to try and move its way up to center itself on the player. So what we need to do is we're going to detach the player from the camera, and then so that it stays in the camera, and then the player is going to come in through the teleport, and then we're going to reattach the player to the camera so it'll start following around again. And what we need is a way to know, hey, he's done teleporting. So what this is going to do is this is going to be called from the actual player controller. So this is just a method that basically says, you know, the player is not null, camera follow is not null. So if the player is equal to null in here, then we're going to reassign the player's transform to the camera follow so that it'll start following him again. So we're going to send that over, and then we're going to save that. And we're just going to jump up there. And then in the player controller, we're going to skip this too, because we don't want to put this in there yet, because I want you to see what happens when you don't do that. And the only other thing would be the scene, which is a whole bunch of changes in the scene. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy that, paste that, save that, and I'll go through what the changes are. You know. And then we're going to come back over to Unity. It's probably not going to load right, so I'm going to close that and reopen it. I'll be back in a sec. Alright, so as last time I did stage select, a whole massive bunch of changes, and it didn't load right, so I closed Unity and reopened it right now. So I'm going to move this out of the way. We're going to see if the things that are supposed to be in here that they're supposed to be in here. So I have a new object here called checkpoints. And this is basically just a parent. This is just a placeholder. Just basically a parent to my other two checkpoints. So what we ended up doing was we imported those prefabs and stuff, right? So inside the prefabs folder managers, there's a new game object in here, prefab called Checkbite Manager. So let's open that up. So inside here, I have become accustomed to one, for the most part, one script being able to do many different things instead of breaking one script to go do that, one script to do that when it's basically the same system. So I did that with Bomb, you know, for when he's launching and shrapnel, etc. So I'm doing it with this checkpoint script too. So the checkpoint actually has three different types. You have the trigger, the zone, and the manager. Now the manager is basically responsible for taking the settings from an actual checkpoint once it's been triggered and storing those settings. And upon the scene load or reload or whatever, it's going to take those settings and change the scene. And so the player starts at a new position, camera starts in a new position, any events that need to be called will be called, etc. And so I have a checkpoint reached when it's used for the manager. This is the flag that for update scene that basically says, oh, okay, yeah, I got stuff, so you should use it. Because otherwise, if that's not set, then it's going to assume, oh, okay, well, no checkpoints have been reached, so it's not going to do anything. Now, this last checkpoint name is basically the name of the checkpoint that was last passed, and so we're going to. So the thing with that is when you define all your checkpoints, just make sure they all have unique names. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. So I'm sure there's a better way to do work around that. But just make sure all your game objects for each checkpoint just has a different name. Checkpoint 1, checkpoint 2, checkpoint 3, not 2 checkpoint 1s or etc. And now you have the zone coordinates, which is basically just a rect. You got a top, right, bottom, left. These are just basically coordinates that you're going to pass it. So it's all X and Y's. So the top and the bottom are like Y coordinates, and the left and the right are X coordinates. And so when we check out the other one, we'll see how we define that zone. Player position is basically just vector 3. This is where the player is going to be set at when the scene gets refreshed, and the checkpoint manager says it's going to move the player to this position. And it's the same thing with the camera position. This is where the camera is going to be moved to. And then this is the camera min position and max position for the camera follow script that basically defines, where the world, where the boundaries of the camera are currently for that part of the world. And then usually you'll pass through like a transition, more likely, that'll take you to another part of the world. So it's kind of like where Mega Man goes up, hits the top of a ladder, and then moves into the next section. And then what we have here is call event when reached. This is not applicable to the manager, but more to the actual checkpoint. So when the checkpoint, if it has an event attached to it and this is checked, it'll be called. Now there'll be some cases where you don't want the event to be called when you pass through the checkpoint. But when it's the manager, regardless, it's going to run that event, because there are cases where, okay, you pass through a transition and maybe some walls move or some other stuff happens, and that's all going to be in that checkpoint function. Well, you're going to want that to be run when the scene reloads, because otherwise it's going to, things aren't going to be the way that they were last left like. So that's what that's all about. So that's the manager. So now if we actually go and take a look at the actual checkpoints, you got the zone and the trigger. So I'm just going to take a look at the zone real quick. It's the same exact thing, except the type is set to zone, and you'd fill in the zone coordinates and all, where you want the player to spawn at, and the camera, and the boundaries, and if any events. Now the trigger is the same exact thing like this, except it's got a box collider set as a trigger, and you would define, what you want your trigger size to be and all that. And then it's got down here the checkpoint script is set to trigger. This zone stuff would obviously be ignored because the trigger is going to call it, or the trigger is going to handle the checkpoint's been passed. And this is all the same stuff, where you want the player to spawn when you die, or when when the scene reloads, etc. And then any events. So basically, those are the two prefabs. And if we go back, now we're going to take a look at the actual checkpoints themselves. And what I'm going to do is mouse. We're going to come over here, take a look at this. So first checkpoint I have here. So checkpoint 1 is defined by this blue rectangle here. So when Mega Man jumps and gets past this transition, goes into this area here, it's going to trigger this checkpoint 1. So when we look at checkpoint 1, the zone coordinates for it are basically these numbers here. And if you actually play around with these numbers, shrink that up a little bit. So if you wanted to mess around with these, so you can change its size, you could go right, left. So that's basically, you can define your box like that. It makes it a lot easier than trying to figure it out. You can start out with maybe like a basic little bit set, and then you can just stretch them out. So it makes it a lot easier when you're trying to define a zone that you want to go in. Or maybe you don't like zones, so then you'll end up using the trigger version instead. Because then you could just use the edit collider. Player position, this is where Mega Man would start at once this trigger gets hit. This is the camera position, and then these are basically the little bounding world for the box, or for the world that we're in. Next trigger, or next checkpoint, would be the one that's down here. And if we look at that, this is basically just a regular old trigger. And so this is the trigger, the size of the trigger, and you can see there's no zone coordinates, but this is where the player is going to spawn at, this is where the camera is going to be at when it starts, and then these are the bounding box. Now this one actually has that checkpoint function that's inside a main scene. And what we originally had was this was actually tied to the transition number 3. So that has now been removed off of the post-transition event. So that's been removed, and now it's been applied to checkpoint 2. So it's down here now. And so what we want to do is, this is checked, call event when reached, and so when this gets triggered, it's going to call that event. So if this was unchecked, it would be there, but it would not be called when you pass the checkpoint. So, and we know that this function, if we were to go look at it, we'll go take a look at it again. But this basically moves the left wall over here and blocks Mega Man into this section, so he actually cannot backtrack after that. And so when the scene reloads, we obviously want that to still be the case, because he's going to spawn here. We don't want him to be able to go back. And so, but if we don't actually call this, then that wall is never going to move. So this is the way we remember how our scene was. And so that's basically the checkpoints, and then the manager gets this stuff sent to it. So now we're going to go take a look at the actual code. So let's go to the scripts, and we should have this script here called Checkpoint. Now, if you're going to be doing this from scratch, you're going to right-click in here and create a new C# script. You can call it whatever you want, but I call it Checkpoint. And you're going to want to basically make sure everything matches up. So, much like the camera transition, I have a public class in here called Checkpoint Settings. Now, this is a way to remember what the checkpoints, if they've been reached, have they not been reached, and basically this is going to keep track of the name and that checkbox. Has it been reached or not? So we need to know what checkpoints have been reached when the scene reloads, so we don't end up doing them again. So now this is the actual class. So this is going to also be a singleton for the manager. Their actual checkpoints are not. So we have this instance in here. Now we have an enum for the three types: a trigger, a zone, and a manager. And by default, I'm just going to set it to a trigger. And then we have these objects here for the player and the camera follow script. And then we have this struct with just 4 floats in it: top, right, bottom, and left for zone coordinates. That's for the actual, if it's a trigger zone, so you define it, and that's what's going to remember those dimensions. And then this is how we keep a list of what's in there. And now if you were to go beyond checkpoint settings and beyond camera transition settings, and you have something else that you need to remember, whatever it might be, you probably need to add another list. So, but this one's just for the settings and the camera transition settings, checkpoint settings and camera transition settings. Now down here, we've already seen this in the prefabs and stuff. So there's a bool checkpoint reached, whether it's yes or no, the name of the checkpoint that was last reached, the zone coordinates if you end up using those, if it's a zone type trigger or a zone type checkpoint, the position for the player where it's going to spawn at, the camera position where the camera is going to start at, the box for the camera follow, and the checkbox call event when reached, and then the actual checkpoint event if you want to use one or not. So the checkpoint gets hit, you're going to basically run some code in a function. Now in the await here, we just make it a singleton. We've done this with the game manager and the sound manager. But we're only going to do it if the checkpoint type set is equal to manager. You're not going to do it for the regular checkpoints, only the manager. So there's only one manager running around. And in the start, what we're going to do is if the checkpoint's not a manager, we're going to get the game objects. And getting the game objects is basically getting a handle to the player and then getting a handle to the camera follow. And in the update, all we're doing here is we're checking to see if the checkpoint is equal to the zone type and it hasn't been reached yet. Then we're going to make sure that the player is not null, like it hasn't died, because this update's still going to be running when he dies. So we want to make sure the player is not null. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to check the player's transform and see if it's within that zone coordinates box. And if it has, then we're going to call the checkpoint reach function. Now, trigger, which is basically similar to this, you're going to see if the type is equal to trigger and it's not been checked yet. And they're going to see if it's the player that's basically going through that trigger. And if it is, then we're going to call checkpoint reached. And this is the game objects, get the player, get the camera follow. And then in checkpoint reached, what we're going to do is we're going to see if the checkpoint is not equal to a manager and it's not been reached yet. So if that's the case, we're going to say, okay, checkpoint's reached, yes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call inside the manager, because the manager is going to be the instance, we're going to call this function called save settings. And then we're going to set inside of the instance that it's been reached. We're going to get the name of the checkpoint. So we're going to be basically passing this up through the pipeline. So the name of this checkpoint, the player position that's saved in this checkpoint, the camera position that's saved, the min and max camera positions. And if the call event when reached is true, then we're going to call the checkpoint event if it's attached. So that's going to be that. 1 second, please. Sorry about that. And then down here in update scene. So this is going to be called when the scene starts. So if there's any checkpoint data, then it's going to basically modify the scene. So we're going to see if the checkpoint type is equal to a manager, and if the manager has a checkpoint reached checked. So what we're going to do is we're going to get those game objects again through the manager this time, though, the player and the camera follow. We're going to call restore settings. We'll go take a look at that after this. So if the player is not equal to null, we're going to take the player's position that's saved in the Checkbite Manager and update the player's position. If the camera follow is not null, then what we're going to do is we're going to take from the manager what's been set in it, the camera min position, the max position. We're going to update the camera follows bounds min and max, and then we're going to take the camera position and update the camera follows. Basically the camera is the game object because the camera follow is attached to the actual main camera. So this is actually the camera's transform position, and we're going to update that. And then down here, what we're going to do is we're going to look for that last checkpoint name if the checkpoint's been found, and we're going to see if that object is not null, then we're going to call the checkpoint event if it's attached. If it's got a checkpoint event, it'll call it. So when the scene reloads, we want to call that last event, or the last event. Now, if you have events that do things like, say you pass through 2 checkpoints per se, and the first one actually did things that the second one doesn't do, you might want to chain them. So first checkpoint, function, does, this, and that. And then what you want to do probably in your second one is call the first checkpoint function and then do whatever inside for the second one. Or you can attach it on multiple events. I actually haven't tried that, but I don't see why that might. You probably have to add on both, but it'd probably be easier if you just chain the functions. Alright, so reset manager, we're going to see if the type is equal to a manager, and you're basically just going to zero everything out that's inside the manager. So we'll take a look at that again when we run the scene. And save settings, we're going to check and see if it's the manager, and then what we're going to do is we're going to call save checkpoints and save camera transitions. So if you have other things you need to save, then you probably create another function and add it here. And so for save checkpoints, what we're going to do is we're going to clear out our list. We're going to start fresh with it. And then we're going to look for all the objects that basically have the checkpoint script on them. And then we're going to make sure that they're not managers. And then we're going to use our settings here, make an object of that. We're going to set the name, and we're going to set the reached, and then we're going to add it to our list. So that's basically going to save all the checkpoint settings for each checkpoint. And then down here, the camera transitions is very similar. We're going to start fresh with that. We're going to look for all the camera transitions, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create an object called camera transition settings from one that we added to our other script. And then we're going to get the settings, and then we're going to add the settings into the list. And so now we have all of our checkpoint settings and all of our camera transition settings saved in these lists. And then the restore it, same, it's the opposite. It's basically, if it's the manager, we want to restore the checkpoints and restore the camera transitions. So if you have something you're creating that's outside of this, you want to obviously create the function and add it here. And then restore checkpoints. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for all the checkpoints. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get the settings, and we're going to search in our list for the name. That's why I was saying the name should be unique for each checkpoint. So you're going to see if these names are equal. If it is, then it's going to return the settings. And if the settings is not null, which it shouldn't be, you're going to basically update the checkpoint with this checkbox. So basically, you're going to recheck it. That's the only thing we save with the checkpoint settings. Then restore camera transitions. We're going to go through all the camera transitions that are in the scene, and then we're going to search for their names. So they all should be unique as well. And then get the settings. If the settings are not null, then what we're going to actually do is we're going to call that put settings. So this was simple because it's just a one checkbox. We didn't need a function for that. But here we're going to call the camera transition and put settings, and we're going to pass in all those settings that were saved. So it takes the settings and reapplies them against the camera transition. We'll do that for all our camera transitions. And then this on draw gizmo selected. This is just so you can see the blue box on the screen. So that's how you can visually see what's going on when you're trying to define a box. So that's how you do something like that. That's something new that we haven't actually done in any of the videos yet until now. So this makes it a little bit easier to visually see what's going on when you're defining things with like a box per se like this. So that's basically checkpoint script. Pretty simple, very simple system. and you can pretty much use it in any other game. You're just going to change up what you're going to be saving and restoring. But the idea and the concept is very much similar to any other checkpoint system, I feel. So now with that done, we're going to see what this looks like, because I didn't apply those other things. So we're going to pass through a checkpoint, and we're going to see what happens with the camera. So let's see if that works, because I haven't actually tested this yet. So I'm going to go here, and what I want to do though is I want you to watch the Checkpoint Manager. So right now, you look at this, changes. There you go. You can see right now there's no settings. So we're going to go pass through one checkpoint right now. Here's the zone. Now you see we passed through the zone. We collected all the settings from that one checkpoint. They got sent up the pipeline into the manager. So now if we were to die and reload the scene, this data is what's going to be basically what we're going to be starting with. So let's just make sure it works when we die. And that's what point that I want to make, is with the camera part. So let's see. So you saw, boom, he just jumps up and it basically went up to where the player was. Well, we don't want that to happen because the camera follow is bound to the player. We don't want it to move up to where the player is. So we're going to remedy that now. So we don't care about that. So over in the Game Manager, in our main level loop, when the init screen, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure, if the camera follow is not null, we're going to detach the player's transform from the camera follows player's transform. So we're going to set that to null. So now the camera is not bound to the location, trying to go find the player, because it's not going to know what to go look for. So we're going to send that over. So we're going to save that, and then let's just go take a look after. There's still one more thing we have to do, but I want you to see what happens. So the camera should not go fly up to the player. It should stay where it's at. But there's still, you see? So it's not following me around anymore, though. So, but if I was to actually go and die, if I was to pass through a checkpoint, then it would still do the same thing, to stay where it's at during the, the whole ready scene part, and then it should start following. So to do that, over in the player controller, we define that function called teleport finish. So when the teleport is done, we're going to tell the game manager, hey, I just landed, I'm done with my teleport. And so we'll send that over, save that, and then the teleport finished. Where is it? It's on the bottom somewhere. Yeah, here it is. Teleport finished. So like I was saying earlier, make sure the player is not null, the camera follow is not null, and if the player's transform in the camera follow is equal to null, then we're going to want to take the transform of the player and reapply it there, so now the camera will start following the player around again. So with that done, let's load it up again, play it. Come over here. Okay, so the camera's following me again, right? So capture that zone, and I'm gonna go die. So now the camera should not dart up on me. It's detached, landed from my teleport, so now it should know, oh, okay, now it's attached. And yes, it is, and it's following me around. So that's how we remedy that problem. And so what I'm gonna do is we're gonna see, so we see that when we, let's just do this. I also fixed so it's not all the way at the top, so it, like, when he dies, it touches the tip of his toe, he actually falls down a little bit, so I actually changed that too. I just changed the size of the trigger on the death spikes, so that it's actually, the trigger's about halfway through, so it'll show that's more like actually really touching him instead of before where it really wasn't. So then we'll skip ahead through here. Pressing any key. So that's over. We're going to come up here. And I did notice there is one problem. I totally, didn't notice it before because I wasn't really doing any run-through transitions, but I'm going to remedy that in a different video. So normally when he goes through a transition, if he's on the ground and running, he should play his run animation, but he doesn't. He actually switches to his idle, and I know why. But I'm not going to fix that here. I'm going to fix that in a different video. There's going to be a video at the excuse me, video at the end where I'm basically going to fix a whole lot of little issues before we go to the finale. So let's move along. What I'm going to do is we're going to take on Bomb Man. Let's go to the player. Give myself bullet damage of 28 just so we can get that done quick. So right now, and then actually what I'm also going to do is we know that we passed through the second camera transition, as you can see here, second checkpoint. So we have all the data from the second checkpoint. If that is actually to die right now, it would start over here. But I'm not going to do that because we already know that works. And what I want you to see is when the scene, because we changed it so that the game manager reloads the same scene, so what should happen is everything should get cleared out. So right now it still has all the data in it. So when the scene reloads, we're going to say, okay, reset manager on next scene, or start next scene is going to reset the manager and wipe all this stuff out, and we should start at the very beginning of the scene again. Which we do. So that is it. So that brings us to the end, and this will work from the very beginning if you do start it from the title screen. I've already tested it many times. So, oh, that's the one thing I need to do. So before we finish, let's just go to the very end. Get past all this. The event. So when we call the event. So let's see what happens with the event. But to be able to see that, we need to look at the left wall, this, and not so much the second checkpoint, but we're going to look at that one too. So you can see this is actually the second checkpoint. This is this transition, the camera transition, and the wall is still on the way left side. So when we pass through this transition here, or this checkpoint, it calls that checkpoint, which I said I was going to go look at. I was going to show you again. So if we go look in the game manager, and then we go look for that function, checkpoint reached, I believe it's called. This alphabetical. Sweet. Let's see if I can find it real quick. No, what was called. Let's checkpoint. Oh wait, no. It's not the game manager. It's in the main scene. Here, so we start the coroutine to change the text that says checkpoint reached, and we move the position of the wall. So we're going to go take a look at that. So we're going to pass through. We're going to pass through the checkpoint. Now you can see that the wall has basically moved on top of the transition, but the checkpoint's only going to, happen one time. So if I try to go left, I can't. I'm locked in. So if I explode, normally when the scene reloads, this wall should be on the far left. But you're going to see that when the checkpoint updates the scene, it's going to call that second checkpoint's event, which happens to move the wall. Now the text is obviously overwritten by the ready, so that's good. So we don't have to fiddle around with that. But the left wall is there again. The transition is still there, and the checkpoint is still there. And you're going to see, because we remembered that our checkpoint, we remembered our settings, whether they've been checked or not, it restored checkpoint reached. So we need to remember that so we don't hit this, call the same checkpoint again. It's already been reached. So that was the point of that little class to save the settings. All we're saving is the name and this checkbox value. And the name is this basically here. So just make sure everything's unique, otherwise you're going to run into problems. Now we're at the end. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the video. That is my take on doing checkpoints. So if you found it useful, learned anything new from it, give it a thumbs up. Always appreciate that. If you haven't been following along, then you can follow along. Subscribe to the channel. I got some more videos before I'm calling it wraps on Mega Man for a while. I'll still put a video out here and there, but the main content core, I'd say, is basically done. And all the source code and everything is up on GitHub, links in the description. So I will see you at the next video. Stay safe out there, have a good day, and goodbye.